Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm your host, Hillary Ramo. Welcome to Real Talk. We're going to be discussing cannabis education tonight. As the legal use of marijuana and other cannabis products grows, consumers are becoming more curious about their options. This includes CBD and THC, two natural compounds found in the cannabis plant. CBD is found primarily in extractions from the hemp plant. It's sold in gels, gummies, oils, supplements, extracts, and more. THC is the main psychoactive compound in marijuana that gives the high sensation. It can be consumed by smoking. It's also available in oils, edibles, tinctures, capsules, and more. Both compounds interact with your body's endocannabinoid system, but they have very different effects. So joining me today is my guest, Dr. Blesching. He's a medical writer, regular contributor in the fields of cannabinoid health sciences, mind-body medicine, phytopharmacology, as well as evidence-based illness prevention and treatment protocols. In addition to his lifelong passion for integrative medicine, his writings are informed by his own rigorous, in-depth research and 20 years experience in emergency medicine as a paramedic for the city of San Francisco. Welcome, Yui. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Hillary, for having me.
Well, this should be a very interesting conversation, and it's one I've been looking forward to having for quite a bit. So thank you for being here. Why don't we just get started with who you are? I mean, you've written a bunch of books, and you have been doing this for quite some time. Tell us a little bit about your story and what brought you to this field.
Sure, Hillary. I was born and raised in Germany, and I went to pre-med school in Germany, and at the time I had to wait for about 2 years to get my spot. And so I decided to travel around the world. And to make a long story short, I ended up in San Francisco, fell in love with the city, and I kind of never left again. Now, when I came here as a young immigrant, med school was cost prohibitive. It's very expensive. So somebody suggested, why don't you go to Stanford? They have a paramedic program and try and see if that suits your needs. And I did. And shortly after I finished, I got hired by the city of San Francisco, by the Department of Public Health to work as a paramedic, which I did until we joined the fire department. The paramedic division was merged with the fire department. And the good thing about being on a fireman's schedule is you have a lot of free time. So I used that time to go back to college, work my way up through a few degrees, culminating in a research PhD. And after about 17 years of working as a paramedic, I came down with a moderate form of PTSD. And so I couldn't do it anymore, but I still like medicine. And so I stayed in medicine, but in a different shape or form, in different capacity. One of my friends, or one of the people that helped me through dealing with PTSD, actually also introduced me to cannabis. And it made such a big and profound difference for me that I actually started to grow my own for, a few years for myself and for some other folks who found themselves in similar positions where they needed access to safe medicine. And so that's how I got introduced to cannabis. I have a bit of a personal experience with it, and I started to look into people. When you're in the medical field, people tend to ask you, what's your opinion about what ails them? And do you think cannabis can work for me? And so I would look into it for some friends. I had a friend of arthritis. So I researched arthritis, and I kept taking notes and finding more and more studies that actually were quite interesting with regards to looking at how cannabinoids are specifically thought to work in cases of arthritis, for example. And so I would then report to her and tell her, what I've learned by looking into these different studies. And then more and more people came along, and I would do the same thing. I would look into it, I would take notes, and I would report back to them. And then that's sort of like how my first book came to be, the Cannabis Health Index, which is a sort of organized fashion of all of my loose notes that I took over time to try to help people, my friends especially, make more informed and discerning decisions to see if cannabis may be, an appropriate treatment for what ails them. And here we are today, chatting and talking about it in ways that are quite remarkable in terms of how big this field of the cannabinoid health sciences and all the various patient populations that can benefit from it has grown. It's quite remarkable, Hillary.
It really is. If I think about all the last few years, how we've watched the laws change, and, we've watched society start to accept it, and it becomes legal in certain states. And we're watching really quite an interesting time to be alive right now, to see all of this. It reminds me of what my grandparents and older people in my family have talked about when alcohol became legal, and how everything sort of shifted and changed. And so there's a lot of information out there. And when somebody goes online to search out recommendations or ideas of what they can do for treatment, or they try to seek out a doctor, a lot of it is very frustrating, actually. It's very difficult to find certain people in legal states that are issuing prescriptions for medical marijuana. And so we're really kind of navigating new territory, I think. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is the THC CBD discussion. So I'd like to start with that. But before I do, I'd like to tell the listeners a little bit about the books. You have written 3 books. One of them is called Breaking the Cycle of Opioid Addiction, Supplementing Your Pain Management with Cannabis. You mentioned the Cannabis Health Index, which is a comprehensive source book combining evidence-based insights from more than 1,000 studies from cannabinoid and consciousness research, which I'd like to talk about too in this hour. And finally, Healing with Cannabis, Optimizing Your Ideal CBD THC Ratio. So let's talk about that. We hear so much wonderful things about CBD. You can buy CBD pretty much anywhere now. It's becoming legal and accepted, and everybody thinks it's great. Well, THC is kind of wandering off to the side, becoming demonized, and that's the bad property that you want in the plant. Can you talk a little bit about why we need both?
Yes, sure. Both THC and CBD are considered the prime cannabinoids because they tend to occur in the plant in the most abundant concentrations. And as such, they tend to have significant effects. And what's quite interesting is that both THC and CBD by themselves have a great number of proven effects, some of them therapeutic and some of them adverse. However, a third category of effects is actually being generated by the ratio between them. And it becomes quite imperative to look at not just the amounts of THC or CBD in the flowers that you are consuming or in the cannabinoid containing products that you're consuming, but also to be aware of what effects the ratio between them can produce in people, in their body, in their mind, and in fact their emotions as well. And so THC is a compound with about 50 scientifically proven effects. CBD trails a bit behind that with about 30 different types of effects. And these effects that are produced by both cannabinoids also interact with each other. instance, CBD is able to reduce some of the effects, some of the harsher effects that some people are experiencing when using THC-rich products. However, you quite rightly talk about a certain trend out there in the industry of where CBD is becoming, you know,
The hero.
cannabinoid, the healing cannabinoid, while THC gets all the bad press about, well, this is the one that will get you high, and this is the cannabinoid that had the adverse effects associated with this, and this is the cannabinoid that produces the slight psychological addiction potential, which is part of the greater picture. And so in that dichotomy, if you will, in that passion that's promoted by a lot of the purveyors of either of these products, you know, sometimes one can easily get lost and take sides and see things in a black and white fashion, and it doesn't do the plan nor the patient any service to look at it in that way, because the bigger picture is fairly complex, and the more we know about it, the more we can make more informed decisions to really create the precise effects that we want in a way that's sustainable.
Could it be possible that each person, when they consume cannabis, they're really dealing with their own individual biochemistry? Does biochemistry play a part in a person's experience of cannabis?
Yes, biochemistry and the person's beliefs both play a significant role in the cannabis experience each of us is going to have. Let me explain a little bit by what I mean by having both physiological and psychological underpinnings. One of the largest patient populations that's new to cannabis are senior citizens. And senior citizens, one of the prime reasons they go to the doctor and ask about cannabis is the various pains that they're dealing with. And here is the interesting part, is if you're of my generation or a little older, you've been socialized by the narrative on the war on drugs, you know, the evil weed from Mexico. Studies have shown that when people are afraid, when they are anxious, their pain threshold goes down. And so when somebody of that patient population goes to the office, they come with an internal architecture of mind that's already full of anxiety and full of concerns about, you know, this particular plant. And so any efforts that they may be making by trying to work with the cannabinoid is already going to be influenced by the beliefs that they hold. So it's already not going to work as well. Besides, to convince somebody who is already feeling anxious about using a product is going to lead perhaps to a lot of people not even going the second step after going to the office, and actually even if they fill the prescription, may not even use it because their fear got the upper hand. And so that's the belief, the psychological aspect of it. But then the physiological aspect of it, there's a lot of science behind that shows that different people and different patient populations, or even within the same patient population, have different responses to various cannabinoids, especially THC. And there's two prime reasons for that. And those are two emerging concepts that begin to explain why that is. One is called endocannabinoid deficiency. And it's a concept has been emerged in the cannabinoid health sciences as a way to try to explain why different people have different responses. And its own cannabinoids as a way to produce balance. balance not just in one organ system, but in all 11 organ systems. In fact, that is the function of the endocannabinoid system, which is a natural occurring balancing system that we all have. In fact, all mammals have, not just humans. And when we're out of balance because of chronic stress, which most of us, are dealing with, our endocannabinoid system gets weakened. Our endocannabinoid release is being diminished. And as such, we are not able to be as resilient as we normally would be. The other concept that's beginning to be used to explain these differences has to do with endocannabinoid tone. And endocannabinoid tone is the idea that our endocannabinoid system, by its presence alone, is able to produce the cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids, those made by the human body itself, by themselves in such a way as to be able to face any stressor and to produce resilience. And when tone is diminished, just as, when that endocannabinoid tone is diminished, then our resilience suffers as a result. And so when endocannabinoid tone in general is reduced, we have less endocannabinoids to balance and to be resilient. And so the deficiency can vary in between one person and another. And that is why it's believed, at least with the current state of science, that is one of the reasons why two people with high blood pressure may respond differently to a compound such as THC or CBD, for example.
Well, I find that very interesting because we didn't learn much about this endocannabinoid system in school growing up, K through 12, and even into college when you were learning about the body system. I don't, know too many people who have learned about this. Why do you think that this has not been given more attention?
Well, if you think about it, it's not just that the public doesn't know about it, but most physicians don't know about it. Even now, with all the science that is out there, and there's over 20,000 peer-reviewed studies that are out there that light up on websites like PubMed, the international database that's monitored and compiled by the National Institute of Health. Even though with massive amounts of studies clearly indicating the value of understanding and working with the endocannabinoid system, only 1 in 10 schools are even beginning to teach about it. And so physicians or healthcare providers are not prepared for working with cannabinoids because they don't really have learned or understand the endocannabinoid system and its complex interactions within each of the different organ system and the organ system, how they communicate with each other. And so it comes as no surprise that there are true gaps in our healthcare system in terms of just the knowledge that isn't out there and isn't spread. And while it's beginning to change, a lot of physicians and a lot of nurses are, their patients are demanding, their patients are coming into the office and asking about it because most people know somebody who's used it and has gotten some benefit from it. So it's just natural for them to go to the doctor's office at their next visit and ask about it. And after 10 patients ask you about it, most people are going to be frustrated and are motivated to learn at least something about it. And so I commend a lot of these physicians that have acquired all of this knowledge, and the nurses and the other healthcare professionals as well, that are actually listening to their patients and went the extra mile to learn on their own time, to see if they can use that knowledge and apply their other medical insights and information that they already use in their daily practice. But then, to address those specific needs that a lot of people are asking for. And so it's nice to see that there are more and more people are coming around. And it's a pity that there isn't an organized fashion or an organized approach from the medical organizations or from the institutions that are teaching these professionals regarding letting them know some practical and actionable information that can really make a difference in terms of addressing their patients' needs.
Well, I don't know about you, but if I were taking the time and money to go through medical school and I got out and I was establishing a successful career and discovered there was a whole system that was operating in the human body, which I was now an expert in, that I didn't know existed, I'd be pretty upset.
Yes, that is certainly, one perspective that's understandable. But, if you look at, for example, there's always new insights. And the fact is that to a point, Western medicine and the machinery that drives it can't really be fully blamed for that, because the insights about the endocannabinoid system were really only discovered in the early 90s. And, when you think about how long it takes for a scientific insight to translate the textbooks and into the curriculums, it's a very slow moving process. And it's a pity because, by now there is enough data to warrant the use of cannabinoids for over 250 different patient populations that could potentially benefit by engaging the endocannabinoid system, either by trying to work with your own endocannabinoids or with using plant-based cannabinoids. And while the data for all of these different patient populations isn't equally spread, there's some where the data is just beginning to emerge and it's very thin. But some patient population, the data is overwhelmingly clear and leaning in favor of using cannabinoids for those conditions.
Well, I hope we're starting to wake up and change that. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are doing really, really good work in doing that. And I know you're one of them. You also wrote a book called Breaking the Cycle of Opioid Addiction, Supplementing Your Pain Management with Cannabis. I find it really frustrating when I go to the doctor and I have a pain issue and the first and only thing that they offer me is an opioid prescription. And when I address my concerns about using opioids and not really wanting to do that, what other options do I have? They kind of look at me with this deer in the eye, deer in the headlight kind of eyes. And they say, well, this is all we have. And I remember a time when it wasn't all they had. So it really has changed the way that I see the medical field. It's more of a sales job for the pharmaceutical company than it is really anything else. Do you find that the pharmaceutical companies in this country are really dictating the cannabis conversations?
Well, they tried, and they tried successfully. And interestingly, it also started in the 90s when the endocannabinoid health sciences were making some real progress. It happened so that in the early 90s is when the pharmaceutical powers that be started to convince or tried to convince, and in fact, ultimately, they were very successful at convincing physicians that the use of opioids in terms of chronic pain was a thing that's acceptable and with proven efficacy, which turned out to be false and at best based on very limited scientific data. But they made a really good sales pitch, and now they're paying the price because there are now a number of states suing various pharmaceutical companies and their distributors to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're winning. And I mean, you see it almost every day in the news cycle. There's another case brought against the pharmaceutical industries, and more of the corruption and fraud that pushed that idea, the notion that the science says it's safe to use for opioids. And it turns out to be actually that is not the case. When I did the research for the opioid cannabis pain book, I had a chance to review the scientific opioid use and for cannabis use and contrast them and compare them side by side. And it was quite interesting. And when you look at pain, you can divide pain in general into 8 different types. And, there's chronic pain and there's acute pain. There's central pain and then there's peripheral pain. There's inflammatory pain. There is noxious pain, there's pathological pain, and there's mental emotional pains. And all the different conditions that may cause any of these particular pains tend to fall in one of these categories. So when I did the review of the available literature side by side, using these 8 pain categories, looking at which are either opioids or cannabinoids tend to work best for what type of pain. One thing became clear very quickly, and before I tell you the results, when researchers check on the efficacy of either opioids or cannabinoids for a particular pain, they grade them. They grade them on a scale from poor to poor to possible to good. They're 4 basic grades to be had. Opioids, it turns out, only gets a good grade when it comes to acute pains. So when you have a broken finger and I have a root canal or, surgery, please means that's an appropriate use for opioid. Give me my morphine, for the 3 days for the acute pain to self-correct. Now, for any other of the pains that I mentioned, opioids get a lesser grade than cannabinoids do. And that was remarkable to see. And but it's even more interesting. It's in the beginning of this talk, we talked about THC, CBD, and the ratio between them. And when you look at those 3 categories, it actually divides these 3 types of categories into 3 types of cannabis. There are 3 chemotypes of cannabis that, by knowing simply the ratio THC and CBD, you can even be more effective than just comparing opioids to cannabinoids. You can also do a cannabinoid to cannabinoid comparison and see which type of tends to work best for these 8 types of pains. And so it's simply knowing that for a healthcare provider will probably double their efficacy rate and their patient satisfaction when it comes to treating pain. It's quite remarkable.
It sure is. In your book, you write in 2012, 259 million prescriptions were written for opioids, more than enough to give every American adult their own bottle of pills. Do you have an idea of how much it is today in 2019? How many prescriptions are written now?
No, because the data isn't available. It's hard to come by to current data. But as far as painting a bit of a context, consider this, that 1 in 3 states are considered to have chronic pain, various forms of chronic pain, either ranging from mild to debilitating. And physicians prescribe, or pharmacies fill enough prescriptions to give every single adult their own supply of opioids. And the CDC estimates that last year alone, over 70,000 people died of drug-related overdoses, and the vast majority of them opioids. And it's difficult to wrap your mind around numbers like that. But let me give you one example. In the entire war, 58,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives. That is a huge number and a huge tragedy, and it needs to be addressed. And just bringing cannabinoids into the picture as an option can make a big difference. And here's why I think why. These horrible numbers of opioid-related deaths, there are states in this country in which these numbers are still increasing. However, those states that have implemented medical cannabis programs or even recreational programs have seen a drop of opioid-related up to 25%. If we were to extrapolate those numbers across all the states, it would mean that over 17,000 people would have been saved by a single plant, in this case, cannabis alone. Those are significant numbers, and those numbers can be improved upon fairly quickly by simply knowing which type of cannabis has the science behind it to direct it towards the different patient populations that suffer from the different types of pain that we mentioned earlier. And so you know, here's a thing to include mix of the discussion. While these studies are correlations, and correlations are not causations, these numbers are strong and they are potent, and they are also confirmed by a great number of individual case studies that I've been following personally. Just looking at the effectiveness of cannabinoids versus opioids, especially in the context of using cannabinoids to mitigate and to overcome opioid addiction in the first place, which can work really well if you know what you're doing.
So it's easy to get a prescription for opioids. There's usually no fear involved with taking them. Most people will accept what their doctors say. And yet we have all of these data, statistics from years ago, and it's kind of interesting to me that you can't get up-to-date data regarding this very important topic. But it is definitely something we need to discuss. I want to switch gears over to cannabis and consciousness as we round the hour. And I want to know what you learned from writing your book, The Cannabis Health Index. You'd said here you did 1,000 studies from cannabinoid and consciousness research. What did you find in this research? What can you say about consciousness and cannabinoids? Because all I really hear around the discussion of taking medical marijuana or taking marijuana or cannabis for your health is pain, 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 pain. If you're not in pain, why should you take cannabis? Well, what effect does cannabis have on consciousness?
Well, cannabis also works for a lot of different mood disorders, like anxiety and depression, for example. And so when we talk about consciousness, let's talk a little bit about mind-body medicine first. There's an overlap of mind-body medicine and the cannabinoid health sciences. And that's primarily due because cannabis works so well for so many different patient populations because it affects the body and the mind in such a way as to support and fortify the body's capacity for self-healing. And it does so primarily in two ways. Fact is, the right type of cannabis at the right dose, given or matched to each individual's patient's needs, will produce two things. It will induce a deep sense of relaxation, and two, it will produce multiple system homeostasis at a cellular level. And mind-body medicine is usually, viewed upon who you talk to on a, you can talk about it like definitions on a spectrum, if you will. On one end, there is, mind-body medicine is medicine that affects the body and the mind. And then there's the orthodox perspective that says, mind-body medicine is primarily governed by the pituitary adrenal axis, and then my favorite definition of mind-body medicine, and this is where consciousness plays into the picture, has actually to do with that the body has an innate intelligence, and that intelligence is using symptoms as a way to communicate. And depending on severity of symptoms, it is either an invitation or a demand for change. And so to take consciousness out of the healing picture, especially when it comes to chronic pains, is a great deep healing, and not the mitigation of symptoms, if you will. And so that perhaps sets a bit of the backdrop or context in terms of talking about, how cannabis can influence consciousness in such a way as to facilitate the healing process. And let me give you, for example, a personal example from dealing with PTSD. One of the capacities of cannabis we already talked about is its incredible ability to help you to relax. This is even extended to being in the presence of otherwise intolerable emotional material. So cannabis can put you into a place when you are feeling feelings that normally would make you run in the worst kind of way, by acting out, by seeking drugs to numb the pain or the shame or the whatever intolerable emotional material you're confronted with. And so cannabis reminds us that we can create a space and that allows us to be in the presence of otherwise really difficult emotions without having to run, without having to be defensive, without having to shy away from them. And sometimes that alone is enough to make a big difference in the healing process of a lot of chronic conditions, because a lot of this stuff is what often underlies it.
Well, again, I go back to, what most people assume cannabis is. It's a dangerous drug that can put you in jail. It's been demonized for so long that it's really difficult for people to then turn around a stigma that has been pounded into their brain for years and decades and decades. Yeah, and to say, hey, now it's a wonder. Now it's a magical miracle healing plant. It just doesn't seem to come easy for some people. So how do you go and deal with this stigma that's really everywhere? Parents have been telling their kids not to smoke it the same way they would tell them not to do another kind of drug, and it's been a Schedule I drug for a long time. So how do we reconcile this confliction when we talk about mind-body medicine? We really do have to consider everyone's individual, not only biochemistry, but state of mind. Some people are, not everybody is all in the same emotional place as everyone else all the time. So when you consume cannabis and you go into that state of consumption, and you feel your pain go away, and then the emotional stuff comes in, and we have a relaxing setting, how do you tell a patient or a partaker to work with this plant in a positive way besides just the obvious healing? I mean, what about meditation? And what about going into, what if you're happy and you want to consume cannabis? What's wrong with that? Because all I really hear, not just, I'm not talking about just from what our conversation's happening, but out there in the world, is that it's okay to take if you're in pain. But what if you're not in pain? How can it help you if you're not in pain? I guess there's no real question in that. It's just more of a statement, actually. But, we're talking about a really complex subject, and we're trying to switch an entire country, state by state, over into seeing something differently and better than we've been taught and trained to see it for a very long time. How do you suggest people overcome the stigma and demonization of cannabis themselves on an individual basis, whether they're looking for pain management or not?
You bring up a great number of great points, and let me respond to it by first of all, pointing out that it's actually horrific that there's still states where people can go to jail for a really good medicine. Second of all, Dealing with cannabis, as fantastic as it is, requires a bit of responsibility on each of us to find out what type of cannabis is going to work best for me. Considering what my beliefs are about it, considering the crazy cognitive dissonance that's been created by the conflicting reports, one, the narrative on the war on drugs and all the horrific things. This is your, the picture comes to mind of the ad. This is your, with the pen and the fried eggs, this is your brain on drugs. And now there's 20,000 studies that indicate the therapeutic potential for all of the different constituents that are contained within the plant. So how is one to reconcile? And I think that the best way to do that is to educate yourself and to help each other educate each other. And one way to mitigate and to address the fears that are born, that are seeded by the narrative on the war on drugs, is to realize that, there is a type of cannabis, the one that contains more THC than CBD, that if taken too much can actually make the pain that you're feeling, that you want to treat, make it feel worse. There is that type of cannabis that can make an anxiety worse. There's that type of cannabis that can make you vomit more or make your insomnia worse. And there is such thing as taking too much. When, for example, if I try to take or employ THC sedative effects for my anxiety, but I take too much of it, then it actually pushes you into an anxious state and may make the anxiety worse. And so simply educating yourself that there are three types of cannabis. One where there's an extremely fine line between a therapeutic effect and an adverse effect, and that's the chemotype 1, the type of cannabis that contains more THC than CBD. On the other hand, a chemotype 3 contains more CBD than THC. And if the THC amount is less than, let's say, 0.3%, there's no risk of any psychological addiction potential. There's no risk of getting high. There's no risk of making any of the symptoms that you're feeling worse. And so there's no risk of adverse effects, and yet you can still harness a great number of the therapeutic effects that you're looking for. Now, a type 2 is right in the middle, which it means a relative equal amount between THC and CBD. And so now the science is beginning to emerge that tells us how to line up these three types of cannabis for very specific patient populations. And so that alone, learning a little bit about how to do that is a big step in avoiding all the negative drama that's often associated with it. And if it turns out that a chemotype 3 doesn't give you the pain relief or the relaxations that you need, you can always slowly but gently dial in and increase your dosage of THC by just increasing the ratio gently and slowly, and then let your experience looking inward into see how your body responds to it, how your emotions relate to it, how your psyche responds to it, and then see what type of cannabis experience is helping you facilitate a deeper healing process. And it's a process, and it's a give and take process. The science can inform us to a point. Our personal preferences about what kind of cannabis experience we wish to have can inform us to a point, but it's still a bit of trial and error, at least 3 or 4 times until you find the type of cannabis constituents that are optimal for you and the type of experience you wish to have and the way you wish to grow. And so most people don't know that they have options, that they have choices, that they can have this much freedom. And so it takes a little bit of time of learning and looking inward. And that is part of the mind-body approach, going inward and checking in and seeing how you want to learn and what each experience have taught you, perhaps keeping some notes, some session log, and fine-tuning the process in that way. And once you have what you need, most likely you're going to be able to stick with it at least for longer periods of time. If you get better over, let's say, 6 months, 8 months, you may find that you need to adjust your profile again, because by now your endocannabinoid tone has improved, your endocannabinoid deficiency has diminished. And so as your healing continues, you constantly that your body is going to want or need different things. And here's the other thing that's interesting. And since we have an endocannabinoid system, and endo meaning within, I've seen a number of patients able to heal and move out of their chronic conditions, out of their chronic state, using various cannabis-containing products, but then eventually adding a practice to their regimen. Like a meditation practice, or they're developing a therapeutic support system. They're adding nutrition into the picture. Little, and over time, they've been able to use less and less of external cannabinoids, but actually learn to produce their endocannabinoids in such a way as to support and fortify their resilience and their healing process, to a point where they hardly ever need to lean on cannabis at all as a medicine, but perhaps just as a preference, or perhaps they occasionally need it, or perhaps they wanted to explore the doors of perceptions that are opened by creating extraordinary states of consciousness, of which cannabis is certainly capable of doing so.
Excellent. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Would it be fair to say that THC helps to release pleasure endorphins in the human body?
Absolutely. Here's the other interesting, as far as the science behind the overlap between mind-body medicine and the endocannabinoid health sciences. Both THC and CBD either modulate or that is influence either in part or significantly over 20 neurotransmitters that also each of them have been identified as having mental emotional components to them. Like, let me give you an example. Epinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with excitement, with fear, with fight, flight, or freeze responses. Both THC and CBD can help you down-regulate epinephrine, for example. And so as epinephrine decreases in your system, you tend to relax. Your sympathetic, your fight, flight, freeze responses calm down, and your rest, repair, and digest phase makes itself known and becomes more present. And that's just one example. There are 20 other different neurotransmitters, for example, oxytocin, associated with trust, generosity, sensuality, is modulated by THC and CBD. So is cortisol, the stress hormone. It's downregulated. There's norepinephrine. There's serotonin, which is a drug made by the human body that is also utilized by much of psychiatry in addressing anxieties and depression. If your serotonin level goes up, because the emotion associated with the serotonin is happiness, and so your anxiety goes down, your depression goes down, and you have more of an expanded emotional reality. THC and CBD both modulate the expression of serotonin. And like I said, there's now over 20 different neurotransmitters and their emotional correlates modulated by the endocannabinoid system by taking THC and CBD. And it's just fascinating to see. And it's interesting to note that it's a two-way street. If we change our chemistry, we change the way we feel. And when we change the way we feel, we change our chemistry. And the endocannabinoid system is the regulatory system that is actually at the front and center of producing these changes.
So THC really could be useful, and people really should understand the benefits of THC and why it's not just about CBD, yes?
Absolutely. THC is one of my favorite plant-based molecules. And if used right, at the right dose, matched to each individual's patient's needs, it can be a wonder drug. It can make a significant difference, not just in producing therapeutic effects, but it also can be used as a way to expand and explore aspects of consciousness, aspects of growth that it touches the transpersonal.
Well, this hour has gone by very quickly. It is a conversation that's needed to be had. I've been speaking with Dr. Yui Blesching. You can go to his website, yuiblesching.com. He has 3 books available: the Cannabis Health Index, Breaking the Cycle of Opioid Addiction, and Healing with Cannabis, Optimizing Your Ideal CBD THC Ratio. If you would like to know more about what we've been talking about, Yui, what do you have going on that listeners can check in? What's coming up new? Any events?
Cannabis book will be out the last Cannabis book will be out in October, I believe. That's what the publisher told me last. And if people want to know more about how to match the ideal type of cannabis with a different, with a particular condition, they can look at it in the Cannabis Health Index, and we're working on a data bank that is going to do that in an updated fashion, but we're not quite there yet. So stay tuned, and as soon as it comes out, we'll make it available on the website, and people can go there and check it out for themselves to see what the science says about what type of cannabis to use for what type of condition.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us live today and sharing your insight and expertise. And I want to let everybody out there know that I will be doing more cannabis education next week, live Tuesday, 9 to 10 a.m., right here on KCAA. 1050 AM, 102.3 FM, 106.5 FM, the stations that leave no listener behind. I'd like to also let everybody know that I will be leading a spiritual nature of cannabis retreat in Denver, Colorado on August 11th. If you are interested in knowing more or registering for that event, you can go to my website, HillaryRamo.com. So I want to just end the note on a positive note, because I brought Dr. Blesching on to have this discussion because probably like many of you, I'm really disgusted in some of the conversations that are going on in this country about something that is so important. And we really do deserve to have a complete picture of what's going on, how we can access it, how we can learn more if we want to, and how to avoid misinformation. You know, we have a lot of people out there on the streets buying product that they really don't even know what it is. They don't know which strain it is. They don't know where it comes from. We have to make sure our medicine is clean, that it's not filled with pesticides, and it doesn't come from corporate entities. And our country is in dire need of understanding the difference. Thank you for being here. I'm your host, Hillary Ramo. This is Real Talk Radio.